Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Payan. I am the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute in Houston, Texas. Thank you for joining us this morning in this online webinar, the fourth of a series of 5 webinars unpacking for all of us the content of the new United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Accord that replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement on July 1st, 2020. Today, we will address some of the key issues that were on the table during the negotiations of the new agreement, specifically the environment. This was the one issue that was central, didn't get as much attention, but it was quite important during the negotiations for all 3 countries, even if they did not see eye to eye on how to handle it. And today, we will understand some of the contours of what finally ended up in the agreement and what it means for businesses, investors, workers, and general citizens, in addition to, of course, smooth trade relations among all 3 countries. To moderate this panel, I want to introduce our very own Baker Institute Will Clayton Fellow on Trade and International Economics, David Gantz. Throughout the year, David Gantz and the US-Mexico Center have been working very hard to get a solid understanding of where we are today on various aspects of the accord. As I mentioned today, it will be environmental issues. David has a very extensive curriculum, a long career, but for our purposes here, I will only tell you that in addition to being the Will Clayton Fellow for Trade and International Economics at the Baker Institute, he is also the Samuel Feckley Professor of Law at the University of Arizona's James E. Rogers School of Law and a Professor Emeritus of International Trade and Business Law at that university. So without further ado, I leave the microphone to David for the rest of this panel. David, welcome.
Tony, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Welcome to our panelists and also to our audience. This is the 4th in a series of 5 planned webinars. There's another one on the 9th of December on customs issues, nitty-gritty, but we thought it was important to focus on environment as part of this fall series. There have been many comments, obviously, and analyses of the USMCA, which, as you know, has been in force since July 1 of this year. And some observers have said, well, 75 or 80% of USMCA really is carried over from NAFTA, which is probably true, but it's not true of environment. I mean, one of the most significant areas for many, particularly in the US and the US Congress, is the coverage, USMCA's coverage of environment. And it's also interesting because there is a very, very significant evolution of environmental provisions in US trade agreements between the NAFTA, which was negotiated in 1991 and 92, and then the side agreement in 1993, through a dozen other agreements until we actually got to what we have in the USMCA. We're fortunate in having 3 of the country's leading experts on these environmental issues as panelists. The first speaker will be Elizabeth Trujillo, the Mary Ann and Lawrence Faust Professor of Law at the University of Houston, and also the founder of the Initiative on Global Law and Policy. She writes in international trade, investment law, and particular in the linkage between these areas and sustainable development and energy. She has taught in the past at Texas A&M, and at Suffolk University, and visited in a number of places, including Harvard Law School. She focuses much of her research and teaching on the overlaps between international trade, investment, and domestic regulatory practices, particularly in energy and the environment. Significantly, she was awarded an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Research Fellowship to write a book on shattered prisms, reconceptualizing, trade through a sustainable development framework, a book which is going to be published in 2021. She's a member of the American Law Institute and on the Executive Council of the American Society of International Law. Our second speaker is Paulo Solano. He is the Director of Legal Matters and of the group in the Commission on Environmental Cooperation in Montreal that deals with citizen submissions. He's a graduate of UNAM in Mexico City, and he has degrees from the University of Essex in the UK and Georgetown Law Center. He has been involved in the legal aspects of environmental analysis, discussion, dealing with compliance issues for a number of other groups prior to coming to the CEC. His particular experience, I think, which is highly relevant to what he's been doing at the CEC in environmental auditing, environmental impact assessment, and all of these issues. And he also publishes the annual report for the Yearbook of International Environmental Law and reports on environmental law developments in Mexico. Our third speaker is Professor Aracima Coronado, who is the director and professor of the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University. She has her degrees from the University of South Florida, and I note from a PhD from the University of Arizona. She focuses her research on the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly human rights issues. And for most of us, at least, environmental issues are often human rights issues as well. She has written and published extensively on these subjects, including on the Texas border. In the past, she taught and was an administrator at the University of Texas in El Paso. And she has also served as an advisor to the Obama administration, and perhaps most significantly for this particular panel, she is also a former employee of the CEC. She was executive director of the commission from 2012 to 2016. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to Elizabeth Trujillo.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that kind introduction. I also want to thank Tony Payan and Lisa and Laura and everyone at the Rice University Baker Institute, as well as my fellow panelists and everyone participating and attending this morning to this interesting, hopefully enlightening discussion for all of you. I'm also thrilled to be here with Paula and Iracima and David, friends with whom I've had the pleasure of working with in academic projects around NAFTA and environment with students. So it's really nice to see all of you here today, this morning. So I thought that, you know, in talking about the improving the environment under the USMCA, which is the title of this webinar today, I would sort of take the opportunity to situate the USMCA within a larger historical framework and think about how it not only situates within sort of the NAFTA, the North American regional relationship, but also within trends that are happening within international trade as well. You know, when I think of the title of our webinar, I ask myself, well, why should we assume that under a free trade agreement, you know, trade, that the framework of trade should be part of the environment and vice versa. And so it's helpful, I think, to think about some of the historical context in linking trade to the environment and how this has played out in the NAFTA context as we think about it in the USMCA. So I will begin with a little bit of, well, when did environmental concerns become part of the trade context? And many of these environmental concerns started in the 1970s around various environmental communities calling for international cooperation around environmental protection, particularly around the ozone layer protection and endangered species. But with respect to trade, the US tuna dolphin case in the early 90s was very important, a case between the US and Mexico in establishing this linkage, particularly with respect to fishing practices that were questionable, that were harming dolphins and in violation of the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act at the time. This first GATT case and then WTO case, and there were several renditions of this case over the span of 10, 12 years, really led to what we know of in the environmental community as the 1992 Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, which not only established the precautionary principle, but it also encouraged states to cooperate in an open economic system that would promote sustainable development and better address environmental degradation in this context. So by the time the NAFTA discussions were underway in the late 80s and 90s, there was already some international awareness of these linkages between trade policy, economic development, and environmental sustainability. But even so, environmental issues really didn't enter into the first discussions of the NAFTA and weren't even part of the original drafts. It wasn't until the time of ratification, and more specifically during the debates around fast track authority, in other words, how to come about to ratify the NAFTA itself in Congress, that environmental groups in coalition with labor groups, which had been much more vocal about some of the labor concerns under the pending NAFTA, came to the forefront of these debates. And this coalition that was formed between environmental and labor groups around fast track helped to raise awareness of labor and environmental concerns in the North American region. So the political compromise was adding two side agreements to the NAFTA, the North American Agreement for Environmental Cooperation and the North American Agreement for Labor Cooperation. And to the surprise of many, as the NAFTA renegotiations were happening and as we finalized the USMCA and began its execution this summer, rather than eliminating environmental issues from trade, the USMCA left very important relevant components of the original NAFTA, as well as in keeping the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, the CEC, which oversees the environmental aspects of the agreement in the region. And arguably, the USMCA has improved on many of the provisions that were in the NAFTA that become much more environmentally friendly under the USMCA. Arguably, it has done the same for labor. So why is that, that environmental protections would be preserved and even expanded in the USMCA? And the answer, I believe, is multifaceted with overarching political factors very much at play. But I would say that much like during the time of the original NAFTA, the USMCA is a result of broader trends that we are seeing not only in trade itself, but also in the role that free trade agreements play in not only lowering tariffs, but also in establishing policy areas that are important for free trade and setting the tone of how relevant domestic regulatory policy should engage with international or regional economic policy. So I will highlight some of those broader trends in international trade, many of which were happening between the years 2013 to 2017. So we can better understand why the conditions were ripe for a USMCA to expand on international issues as it did, especially finalizing it in a relatively short amount of time from the start of the NAFTA renegotiations. So first of all, as compared to 1994, when very few trade agreements existed, and I mean preferential trade agreements, regional bilateral trade agreements, by 2013, we had well over 300 preferential trade agreements around the world. And during the 2013-17 period alone, there were 4 major mega agreements that were in the making. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, the TTIP, which was the US-EU Trade Investment Partnership Agreement, the CETA, the Canadian European Trade Agreement, and the AGEN Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which has just been signed on November 15th on Sunday. And of those, the US was part of the negotiations of 2 of them, the TPP and the TTIP. Since 2016, the TTIP is on hold and the US pulled out of the TPP. However, in particular, the TPP, the TTIP, and the CETA are part of what many would call deep trade agreements. These deep trade agreements are not just about the reduction of tariffs. In fact, world tariffs as a whole, except in agriculture and textile, are down to about 3% as compared to what usually is reported around 40% in 1947. Deep trade agreements also set policy strategies by focusing on non-tariff barriers, those fiscal and non-fiscal measures such as regulation that may impact trade patterns and trade liberalization. So now agreements like the USMCA include chapters on things like e-commerce, intellectual property provisions, but also protections for labor, environment, and other types of social type policy areas. So it's not surprising that in the USMCA, we would see many provisions addressing these areas, and many of which are very similar to those in the original TPP. Second, regional trade agreements tend to be more explicitly more explicit in terms of what we mean by regulation. So redefining forms of regulation, it's no longer just command and control, it's also market-driven, voluntary forms of regulations that we must take into account. And many agreements, including provisions for enhanced dialogue among regulators across borders, coordination strategies that include creating transnational regulatory committees to facilitate dialogue and coordination. A third, due to a rise of various global economic players, such as China and other Asian countries, as well as the role of developing countries, we see different players at the table in setting trade patterns and regulatory norms. And this has led to enhanced forms of localism and, as we would say, in trade protectionism. So you see provisions in some of these mega agreements like the right to regulate. And these are much more prevalent in trade agreements today than they were in the past. This is happening at the same time that countries are moving away from international dispute mechanisms. And finally, of course, I think there's a broader sort of global consensus that climate mitigation strategies are needed and that trade must make room for these strategies, and that countries must be allowed to implement their own decarbonization strategies and related disaster relief mechanisms. So, what are some of the differences between USMCA and the NAFTA itself regarding the environment? Well, first of all, the environment now is an integral part of the trade agreement, right? It's no longer just a side agreement. It's a part, it's chapter 24 of the USMCA. This is more than just a structural thing in my view. It also has a political and legal force to it in that it more explicitly links the trade area with those of environmental protection. Some aspects of the original agreement on environmental cooperation have been incorporated into Chapter 24, for example, the submission process, and the agreement on environmental cooperation has been updated and executed in the July 2020 execution of the entire USMCA. Second, the provisions in Chapter 24 are more expansive, much following along many of the provisions we had seen in the original TPP. The scope and objectives includes environmental protection, quote, trade-related environmental issues through cooperation and furtherance of sustainable development, end of quote. It also recognizes that environment plays an important role in the economic, social, and cultural well-being of indigenous peoples and local communities, and the importance of engaging with these groups in long-term conservation of the environment. But ultimately, the intent is not to improve environmental standards, but rather to ensure that each country may establish their own levels of domestic environmental protection and be able to modify them accordingly. And this is very much along the lines of the original NAFTA, although there is language in there about parties striving to improve the environment, and that environmental law should, however, not constitute a disguised restriction for trade. So there's this balance that needs to be obtained. Areas that are covered, specific areas include that we didn't see in the NAFTA: management for fisheries and fishery subsidies, for example. That includes a notification process every 2 years for these for specific subsidies around fisheries. Management around pollution, marine pollution, sustainable forest management, environmental goods and services, trade and biodiversity, corporate social responsibility, voluntary regulation. And finally, I think there's an enforcement through enhanced dialogue. So as dispute resolution overall plays less of a role in the USMCA than it did under the NAFTA, having been eliminated in other parts of the NAFTA, remaining in some parts and eliminated in others. We see this line of trend in many FTAs today. Chapter 24 allows for dispute settlement, but there are layers of consultation processes in place. And some examples of this enhanced dialogue is through the establishment of an environmental committee, which is separate from the commission. unclear exactly what the role of that committee could be, but it could take on a more expansive role in terms of allowing for more dialogue and harmonization among regulatory norms in specific areas across 3 countries. It's made up of senior government representatives and of relevant trade and environment agencies. So again, further linking the trade and environment area. This is all in line with these newer deep trade agreements, this regulatory cooperation, more dialogue, less dispute resolution. Chapter 28 is a chapter on good regulatory practices. We didn't see that in the NAFTA. Mostly it's about transparency, but again, you know, in the TPP, we actually have a separate chapter on regulatory cooperation, the CETA as well. We don't have that in the USMCA, but the fact that there is something about what does that mean to have good regulatory practices is a good improvement. So I think that there are other areas of the USMCA that I can talk about more in the Q&A. I just wanted to highlight that the phytosanitary measures chapters, the technical barriers on trade chapters, all create these types of committees. And, you know, these are relevant areas for things like eco-labeling, food safety. And so this is also important for environment. But these chapters also incorporate specific areas, provisions of the GATT and of the WTO, which also begs the question, what is the relationship now moving forward of the USMCA and regional integration to the multilateral? Again, it's very consistent with this sort of rise of various preferential trade agreements throughout the world, dealing with deeper type trade agreements. But at the same time, you have committees that are working on trade and environmental issues at the WTO. And so it'd be an interesting question to know whether the environmental committee at the regional level might have more conversations with the WTO Trade and Environment Committee or not. In conclusion, there are many aspects of the USMCA that we can be happy about, I think, when it comes to the environment. It is definitely consistent with the more recent FTAs and current trends in trade and environment relationship. It does not go as deep or as far as the CETA, in my view, in terms of integrating trade, a liberalization with that of sustainable development. But it certainly does take a very important step forward in the direction towards some form of North American governance structure for environmental protection in the context of trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Paulo Solano, please go ahead.
Thank you, David, for your introduction remarks. Tony Payan, thank you for the invitation. Baker Institute and Rice Institute for Rice University for considering my participation. I'm going to go ahead and quickly talk about the submissions process on enforcement matters under the USMCA Chapter 24. And I will go and basically provide an overview of what was on the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, which was replaced by the newly ECA, or the Environmental Cooperation Agreement. I will also provide what are the characteristics and what are the changes in the submissions process under Chapter 24, and at the end I will provide you and share my screen with some statistics numbers on the active submissions. So the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation created the Commission for Environmental Cooperation under Article 8. CEC, the CEC is an international organization, and its mission is to essentially undertake the implementation of NEAC. The CEC administers a transnational cooperative work program that is authorized by the Council, and we implement, and the CEC implements the submissions on enforcement matters process. In the inception of the CEC under NEAC, we were established with 3 permanent bodies. The Council, composed of the Cabinet Ministers, the Secretary, which is established in headquartered in Montreal, and its role is essentially to implement the cooperative agenda that is established by Council and is approved by Council. The Secretary also administers the SEM process. And the third permanent body established in the CEC is the Joint Public Advisory Committee, which is a body originally of 15 members, now is down to 9, which essentially its mission is to advise the Council on areas of environmental cooperation. So I will touch on what is the relationship between the USMCA and ECA, and Elizabeth Trujillo did an excellent explanation of the original NAFTA and what led to the NAFTA transition under USMCA, and how, what are the main features. But I think it's important to understand what is the relationship between the USMCA and the Environmental Cooperation Agreement. So the ECA was negotiated in parallel to the USMCA. Both negotiating teams met in the different locations and were construing the new language for the ECA. Essentially what the ECA did is continued the establishment of the CEC as originally set in the NEAC. It continues its structure, its permanent bodies, its modalities, and it adds language that it also implements the submissions process. But the difference is that the same process is now under the USMCA. So all the submissions process that was originally in NEAC, it was taken, putting into language into Chapter 24 USMCA, and it created a bridge between both agreements in Chapter 24. So the Secretariat and the Commission for Environmental Cooperation implements the submissions process. Other aspects of the ECA, I'm not going to go very deep into the ECA. I want to talk more about Chapter 24, but ECA essentially reiterates the annual contributions from each party. It allows the supplement of funds in kind from other outside sources. Council oversight of the Secretariat is consistent to what we saw under NEAC. So there's perhaps more presence of council in the oversight of Secretariat and JPAC. And JPAC, as I said, it goes down from 15 to 9 members. It also, the ECA limits the membership to 4 years with the possibility of an extension. So back to Chapter 24, and I think it's important to say again, unlike NAFTA, the environmental obligations are now contained in the text of the trade agreement, which is very extensive on the areas of cooperation and areas of commitment of the three parties. Now, the submissions process, as I said, integrated into Chapter 24. It also, the Chapter 24 include the obligation of the parties to take the effective enforce of their environmental laws. That is a very similar language that we found originally on NEAC, on Article 5.1. And it essentially, Chapter 24 continues all the environmental, or sets the basis to continuation of environmental cooperation by the CEC. Very important, I think that was also mentioned moments ago by Elizabeth, the creation of the Trinational Environment Committee, which function is to oversee the implementation of the chapter. The committee also has a relationship with the CEC, and in particular with the CEC Council. The Environmental Committee provides input to the CEC Council on areas of cooperation, meets every 2 years. The Environment Committee has now a role in terms of the submissions process. I want to touch about what this role is. So aside from the same process, aside from the submissions on enforcement matters process, most of the CEC related provisions, operation, cooperative agenda, council functions, JPAC functions. Apart from everything is now on the ECA, which replaced on July 1st the former North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation. One important aspect is that all the USMCA provisions took effect on July 1st. That means that all the active submissions that were existed at the time of entry into force are going to be continued to be administered under NAAC. So NAAC is not really gone. We're still conducting and implementing the process with respect to 3 active submissions. One important, and I think that's, we would want to talk about the main changes in the SAM process is the definition. I think is the most important aspect is the definition of environmental law. While the areas of what consists environmental law traditionally release discharge of emission of pollutants, hazardous toxins of chemicals, wild flora and fauna, those are still in the definition of environmental law. But the most important restriction is that it is now restricted to only federal laws and regulations, and most importantly, that these federal laws and regulations have to be enforceable by action of the central level of government. So unlike the former NAAC, where we could process submissions related to state law or even municipal regulations, we are not, the process now does not allow that. It is only federal laws and its regulations. The language for filing a submission is pretty much the same. Any person of a party may file a submission asserting that a party is failing to effectively enforce its environmental laws. Those submissions filed shall be filed with the Secretary of the CEC. This is Article 2427. No significant change other than maybe expanding the reference to include any person of a party. So I believe that now clearly includes corporations and possibly First Nations or in the 3 countries. The process established, the process is essentially the same. There's a submission where anyone can assert the failure to effectively enforce, provide the backup information to support the submission. We have a certain period of time to allow the submission, admit the submission. We issue a determination on admissibility, and we can request a response to the party in question. The party has up to 60 days to notify the existence of pending proceedings that are related in connection with the submission, in which case that ends the submission, and that's a very restrictive definition of a pending proceedings, at least the one that we continue to use. And there is also the possibility for the party to file information regarding the enforcement, and that's where most of the party response provide information on how they have implemented the law in question. So until now, the process is essentially the same, other than the issue of environmental law. I would say it is essentially the same. The USMCA Chapter 24 opened the door for something that didn't exist before, which is the follow-up to factual records. And this is an area where the Environment Committee plays a role, because the Environment Committee may recommend the CEC Council follow-up cooperative activities under the CEC agenda. So I think that's it is an important change. We will see how it develops, how it evolves over time. There is also a provision on Chapter 24 where the parties will report on finished or completed factual records. Now, these already existed. It was a practice that the parties undertook since, I believe, 2013, following a ministerial declaration. It was a political commitment to do so. but it wasn't in the agreement. So the parties agreed to include this practice into the agreement. We will also see how this develops because formerly these reports on closed, in that case, in closed factual records or submissions were done were conducted in camera. There were no public session on reports on closed submissions. One important, and I think it's interesting aspect outside of the USMCA, and it is outside of the realm of the USMCA, is the USMCA implementing legislation in the United States. This legislation put forward by the US Congress in order to implement the USMCA provides a follow-up mechanism, at least in the domestic aspect in the US, which basically states that once the interagency committee in the United States receives the factual record, it may provide recommendations to the party in question. So it is something we never seen before. It's an interesting feature. We will see how this develops. I'm going just to quickly share my screen with you on a couple of graphs that I want to share with you. Basically, it's on the USMCA new timelines. These timelines that we used to have to process submissions were, and I'm talking on behalf of the Secretariat, were greatly diminished. We used to have under North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation 30 days to qualify admissibility, 30 days to request a response. Now, in total, we used to have 60 days. Now it's 30 days. So in this table, you see how is the impact in each step of the process. The only step that the parties didn't establish a timeline, which I think is important, is on the council vote. The council used to have 60 days under NEAC, under the guidelines on the NEAC. Now it's there's no timeline, no deadline, no timeline. The impact is yet to be determined. What's going to be the timeline on all the impact on the timely processing of submissions. So as a result, we are left with less with a reduction of 10 months in processing the submission and the factual record. We of course have greater pressure to process submissions in a timely manner, meet the deadline in processing the submissions, and meet those timelines in the development of factual records. I think this is going to have an impact on the process. Quickly, the number of submissions we have up to date, 98 submissions under the former agreement, NEAC. We haven't received yet our first submission on the USMCA. We're still waiting who's going to file it. Half of the submissions have been from Mexico, 33 Canada, US 12. There's been these rare cases where we see submissions from submitters addressing both Canada and the United States environmental law. Today, we have published 24 factual records, 14 from Mexico, 8 Canada, and 2 on the US. I think this graph is interesting in terms of we wanted to know where the submitters come from. So these are not submissions, these are the submitters. Where do they get organized and file submissions? Their top 5 regions: Ontario, Jalisco in Mexico, Quebec in Canada, New York, and Mexico City. Those are the top 5 regions where we see the submissions are coming, or submitters are coming, filing their respective submissions. Here, this graph represents these numbers, Articles 15.1, 14.1, 2, 14.1, represent the former agreement, but it will tell you how was the evolution of our timelines in processing submissions. We saw a deep decrease in terms of the timing to processing submissions after the council authorized the new timelines in 2012. Now with the new timelines, I think these timelines are going to go even deeper down. And this is where I, refer. I'm gonna go on the timeliness effect on council vote. The council does not have a timeline yet established under the USMCA. It was under the guidelines of the submissions process under NEAC. And back in 2012, you saw that we saw an impressive decrease in the voting timelines for council. I believe that was an effect of the timeline that it was established under the guidelines back in 2012. Now, without a timeline, it's a question of whether the council will commit to a timeline to vote on factual records. One important thing, and before I forget, under the old agreement, the NEAC, the council voted twice, voted to authorize the development of a factual record and voted to publish the factual record. Under the new agreement, the only vote that a party can execute at the second stage, at the publication stage, is only against the publication. That means that after 60 days, we receive no vote from the parties, we can go ahead and publish. I think that's I believe that's an improvement, because sometimes because of the policy agendas and other factors, we don't get those votes for publication on time. This will allow for a timely publication of the factual record. Active submissions, 3 active submissions from Mexico. We're still waiting a vote from council to go ahead and develop factual record. And quickly, the most recent factual record is from Canada, the Alberta Tailings Ponds, published in September 2020. We're going to provide a public presentation of the factual record with a Sustainability Network on December the 2nd, so stay tuned. That's going to be a very, very interesting presentation. With that, I stop my my sharing and get back to you, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. Now we will hear from Professor Coronado. Please go ahead. You have to unmute.
Good morning. I echo Elizabeth and Paolo's congratulations and appreciation to David and to Tony, to Rice University and to the Baker Institute for inviting us, and especially to the technical people that make this happen. I really appreciate the work you do, because without you, this would not happen. So I'm going to share my screen. And as I do that, I want to ask all of us a question about how do we evaluate the effectiveness of environmental institutions and international environmental regimes. Now, I have been working in the environmental arena for, I want to say 40 years, if not longer. And so I want us to think about the impact all of these trade agreements have, all of these institutions have on the future generations, because I think, that's very important to keep in mind. I want to share with you my, I'm sorry, hold on a minute. How does this work here? My source of inspiration. I am a product of the Sonoran Desert. And to me, this is one of the areas where I work. And this is what keeps me inspired and motivated every day to do the work that I do. The other thing I want us to look at are the environmental impacts of the border wall. Here we are, trade partners, we love each other, we have all of these wonderful agreements, but yet, the Trump administration really moved forward in developing this wall and the impacts it's had on the environment of the border region. I shared this picture with you because I have been working most of my professional life in colonias in Texas, and we have the solution, but we don't do it. These are 2 people that I met a couple of years ago, again, trying to get access to water. And right now with COVID, I cannot imagine how 500,000 people in colonias in Texas are faring because of their lack of water and sewer infrastructure in their communities. So I want us to also keep that in mind. Another problem that I have been working on and I have been trying to understand, and I think we have the solution, but there's no political will to address it, is the issue in Tijuana and the impact that the raw sewage has on the California coast and in the communities there. And that we still have, contaminated water in the region. So I just wanted to share that with you because I want us to kind of get an idea of, where I'm coming from. So the first thing I want to say is I was delighted to hear that the CEC survived. And I'm very pleased to see that the SEM process has been included because it does shed light on environmental problems in North America. And I'm very happy that Paolo is now in charge of that unit because he has worked very hard over many years to do right by the citizens of North America. Now, one of the things about the SEM process, while it might not solve the problem, it really does allow communities to get visibility and to get attention. I'm reminded of a community I worked in Shreveport that was dealing with a refinery in the neighborhood. And the minute the submission was filed, EPA reached out to them, and they had been trying to reach out to EPA for years, and they were never successful. So it does allow for visibility, and I think that's important. I am happy to note the highlights as I see them of the Environmental Cooperation Agreement, and I'm going to try to summarize my comments so that I don't replicate what Elizabeth and Paolo said. I think one of the important things I see is that the appointment of the executive director makes no reference to nationality and allows for renewal for multiple periods rather than for the 3-year term. I think another thing that the Environmental Cooperation Agreement includes gender balance as a factor to consider in the hiring of staff. And I think that's also important, even though I have to say the CEC is very good about having gender balance. I also like the idea that there is a cooperative agreement and they list alternatives to projects and programs and activities. And so they're going to be working in 5 major areas, which is supporting green growth and sustainable development, reducing pollution and supporting low emissions, resilient economies, conserving and protecting biodiversity and habitats, promoting the sustainable management of natural resources, and strengthening environmental governance. So I think that when the parties come together, they always struggle with what are we going to do? What projects are we going to work on? And I think this cooperative agenda will help them to set forth their work. I was disappointed to learn that solar energy is not included in the cooperative agenda. And I was disappointed also to learn that the NAAC provisions for transboundary environmental impact assessment and the Article 13 Secretariat reports are not going to be carried forward. And I think if we look back at the example of Tijuana and San Diego, the transboundary environmental impact assessment is critical. I was also disappointed to see that the NAPICA grants would not be included in this work. NAPICA grants are for community-based organizations where they do a lot of good work at the local level. I didn't see much inclusion for NGOs, and I think NGOs need to continue working and doing more. And also, I would like to see more cross-border cooperation in border communities, and that I did not see. So while I celebrate, congratulate, support this agreement, I think it's necessary but not sufficient to address the environmental issues in North America. As I mentioned to you, there are many problems that we have. I shared with them. Another one is the problem, I think, of Mexico not enforcing its environmental impact statements in major projects. I would like to see more environmental review of the Mayan train and the situation with the airport in Mexico City. That is an environmental issue that I think needs to be addressed and could be addressed through the SEM process. I don't see climate change also included in this. I think I saw low carbon economy, but that's not enough. I think we need to do more work on climate. I think we also need to focus on the water issues on the US-Mexico border, especially the water debt and all of the agricultural practices that are taking place, which maybe we need to revisit. What is it that we need to grow in the border region so that we minimize the misuse of water? The issue of Canadian mining companies in Mexico was a major theme when I was the executive director of the commission. Every time we had a meeting in Mexico, the issue of the Canadian mines was a problem, and I don't know if that's been addressed to anyone's satisfaction. I also would like to see environmental justice issues addressed in the 3 countries. And I think that all of us throughout North America need to work at different levels. What can we do in our homes? What can we do in our neighborhoods? What can cities do? What can counties do? What can state, federal governments do? And what can we do internationally? I think people need to feel that they're doing something to feel good about protecting the environment. And I think right now, a lot of people don't feel very good. I can tell you that my friends and former colleagues at USEPA are demoralized. I think they need to recover from the damage that the Trump administration did in disparaging scientists and their research. I think the Trump administration validating the science that's conducted by industry-paid scientists undermines the peer review process. And I think the legacy of these changes is going to stretch well beyond Trump's presidency. The other issue is the key rollbacks of the Trump era. Making it easier to lease public land for oil and gas drilling, enabling the expansion of offshore drilling. It proposed making 85% of the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska available for oil and gas drilling, and amending the rule that reduced toxic air pollutants from petroleum refinings. The Trump administration rejected the science calling for tougher air pollution rules. And I think that I just want to remind everyone that while these trade and environmental agreements are important and should be celebrated, much environmental work remains to be done in North America and the world. And with that, I will conclude because I really look forward to some of the questions that the audience may have. And thank you again for inviting me to participate.
Thank you, Professor. What I'd like to do now is to take a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is I will address first to Elizabeth and then let Professor Coronado add anything she wants. What standards does the agreement, and I would add the words, if any, provide to reduce global warming, climate change, and I would add directly or indirectly. So Elizabeth, why don't you comment on this first?
Yes, thank you for that question. Well, I agree with Irasima in the sense that with many of the aspects, the sort of the challenges that the USMCA offers for real sort of improvement of the environment in North America. And one of those is that climate change is really not mentioned in the agreement. You know, there is some reference to aspiring for lower fuel emissions and for allowing countries to establish and modify their own laws in ways that could help further that. But it doesn't provide any guidance as to the extent to which countries can do this. And it still be compliant with trade. And I actually think this is one of the areas where most work needs to happen with respect to the trade and sort of sustainable development / climate change arena. There needs to be more dialogue between trade regulators and the climate change and environmentalist policymakers to understand the needs that both sides have. In many ways, they speak very different languages. What is considered to be protectionist, which would impact trade in negative ways on the trade side, is actually considered to be a good thing, let's say, for the environment on the environmental side. And so there is a way in which these can be reconciled. And I think the green economy, the focus on reconciling these, both the business interests in helping ameliorate climate issues as well as trade liberalization. I think there's an opportunity there for a lot of a good discussion and some coordination. I also think that there's an opportunity. I think the USMCA creates a nice platform for more dialogue and more governance in this area, because many of these solutions for climate change mitigation strategies are local and they're domestic. So I was very intrigued by Paulo's comment that, you know, environmental law is defined on the federal side because, you know, many of the decarbonization strategies that we see, or strategies around other areas like fracking, for example, and drilling, are state. But within the United States, as you all know, it's very complicated, right? It's state and federal and so forth. So how does that play out in terms of CEC oversight for these things and the role that it can play? So that would be my comment.
Thank you. Urasaba, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just want to refer you, there's a book called North American Borders in a Comparative Perspective, edited by Correa and Conrad. And I have a chapter in there, chapter 13, that deals with this kind of how do you evaluate effectiveness and what kind of measures do you have to address climate change. And it's hard, it's difficult, and politically the governments don't want to go there. Whenever we talked about harmonization of standards, let's all measure the same thing, let's all get on the same page, it was superficially done, but no one really wants to get down to the nitty gritty. And I think it emboldens all of us to ask of our institutions and our governments to do a lot more.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like Pablo to comment if he wishes, but I also want to direct a separate question to Mr. Solano at the same time. And what led to the scope of environmental law in the new agreement, and who advocated those changes, and what kind of an impact will it have, including any comments you want to make on earlier submissions. So you have the floor, Pablo.
So, I mean, I don't know who led specifically or who championed this restriction on the definition of environmental law. Clearly, there were the parties negotiating on the negotiating table, and they perhaps throw this, and they all agreed. What I can tell you is what is going to be the impact in the process. It's going to be an impact on admissibility of submissions. In the case of, and maybe it's important to distinguish what happens in each country. In the case of Mexico, we have, most of the environmental authorities is federal. The most significant, the majority of submissions addressed federal law, and most of them, if not majority, federal environmental impact assessment. More recently, we saw a surge in submissions addressing environmental impact statement laws at the state level. That has led, in case of Mexico, to publication of at least one. There's only been one factual record at the state level in Mexico. There's one, yes, which is the agricultural burning in Sonora. In the case of the United States and Canada, most of the submissions relate or used to relate to federal law because of the federal provincial arrangement. In the case when NEAG used to be in force, only 3 signatory provinces in Canada agreed to be bound by NEAG, and that's their own legal system, and only we had at that time Quebec, Alberta, and Manitoba. We had only one factual record out of the 14, I believe, half of the lead that addressed the provincial law in Canada. So it's there is an impact, but it's limited. Now in the United States, there is a lot more authority of the states, even though on the SEMPER and the submissions perspective or experience, we haven't received many submissions on the US addressing state law. So in terms of the experience, there's more of that in the case of Mexico. In the case of Canada, most of the submission addressed the Federal Fisheries Act. Almost, I would say 9 out of 10 addressed the Federal Fisheries Act, with some exceptions. So that's that. And in the case of the United States, we will see how this impact evolves. But I have to say that most of submissions in the case of the US address federal laws. So that's the kind of and I mean, as I mentioned, a couple of examples of submissions addressing subnational laws from the state and municipal regulations.
Thank you. Okay, next question. I think we'll start with Elizabeth on this one. Do you perceive that the investment protection under NAFTA, and I guess we're talking here about Chapter 11, and the investor's ability to invoke investor state dispute settlement has had any impact on governments' willingness to adopt, strengthen, or enforce environmental laws or regulations in any of the three countries? And I would add, and do you think that the decrease in the scope of ISDS under USMCA will make a difference?
So that's a really good question. Investment is one of the other unique factors of the original NAFTA, that in a bit, right, a bilateral investment treaty was incorporated into a trade agreement. Another area where we see an overlap of two different regimes that have some commonalities, right? And so the main thing is that under an investment agreement, a private actor can sue a government. As you know, under the USMCA, there's a reduction on the dispute settlement mechanism. It's no longer allowed, at least between the United States and Canada, which is where most of the submissions were anyway, under, especially around environment. So there were very many less ones in terms of environment between US and Mexico. Will it have impact moving forward? Again, I think it kind of goes back to this trend that I was talking about, that there is a move anyway, sort of away from international dispute settlement, maybe less so in the investment side, and that is true. Even the CETA has this sort of investment court, right, which we're still trying to figure out how that's going to really work, but to sort of as an appeals mechanism, if you will, for investment disputes on the for Canadian and European investment disputes. But we see a lot more, enhanced regulatory cooperation and dialogue. And so if both things are happening at the same time, and if there's real dialogue and there's real work being done between regulators, trade regulators, and environmental regulators, then I would say that it doesn't make a lot of difference, because as long as that's happening and that dialogue is happening and something is being implemented, and we can create some regulatory norms around how we deal with North American environmental issues, and we actually implement those and operationalize those at the local level, then having a dispute settlement mechanism or not may not necessarily impact whether or not we are helping the environment in this area or not. Now, will it impact investors? Well, investors can also be some of the parties that sit at that table that talk about what regulations make sense. Now, that might have its pros and cons depending on which side of the table you sit on. But, definitely, I think the trend is away from dispute settlement and more dialogue, more discussion, and particularly at the regional level. I think this is the opportunity that regional agreements have, even though it creates more fragmentation from a multilateral trade standpoint. It also allows for more real specific dialogue in areas that are very specific to a region, to the problems that the particular region has in the area of the trade and environment. And I think that's an opportunity, even for investors.
Thank you. Russell, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah.
Okay. Pablo? Okay. Let me move on then. Let's, I guess for Dr. Coronado, this is good.
Mm-hmm.
How might USMCA impact the cities of the two Nogaleses, Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, Sonora, which for those of you who are weak on Arizona geography, are on the border about 60 miles south of Tucson, economically, socially, and in the next 5 years?
Well, obviously, it's someone who cares deeply about Ambos Nogales, which is where I grew up. I'm from Nogales, and so thank you for asking the question. I think more trade is going to lead to more pollution. Clearly, if more companies open up in Nogales, Sonora, more opportunities for people, more jobs, it's going to have more pollution. One of the things that Nogales, Sonora needs to do is to fix its water and sewer infrastructure and have flood infrastructure as well, because as you know, during the monsoon seasons in the summer, every year there are tragedies, there are accidents, and that is a problem that affects both communities. One of the problems I see is the truck traffic. We have been dealing with that for years, and that is the truck traffic coming from the Valle de Sinaloa, bringing raspberries, blueberries, avocados, everything that we enjoy throughout North America, and the impact that it has on the pollution in both communities. I would love to see the trucks inspected at the point of origin, sealed, and just come through the border without having to wait sometimes hours in Nogales, contributing to the air pollution. So while I know it creates jobs and opportunities, it also creates more environmental impacts that we all have to live with at the local level. And our children and our elderly suffer. Air quality that is not good affects our well-being.
Okay, if I could follow up with one of my own questions, do you think that the somewhat expansion of the North American Development Bank can help with these issues?
I would hope so. And I think that the problem, is so big, and some things have been done, but it's not enough. I mean, the truck problem, we've had that since I grew up in Nogales, and that has been a way of life since I grew up. So if we can't figure that out, and it's almost 61 years, then we have some issues, right? How can we have the political will to change these things? The issue of water and sewer in Tijuana, the solution is there. Get people water and sewer infrastructure and build wastewater treatment plants that work. It's not a technical problem. We have the solution, but we don't have the political will or the economic resources dedicated to addressing these problems at the root cause.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to a couple of others. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about this, but I'll raise it. How is the building of the Dos Bocas refinery? This is a gasoline refinery that the Lopez Obrador administration is spending about $8 billion on. How is that going to affect the environment? Anybody want to talk about that?
All I want to say is they should go solar and forget about building the refinery, but I think that train has left the station.
Pablo?
Well, I'll only say that the submission process is open for consideration. We have a history of submissions addressing environmental impact statement, so I believe this could be a future submission. We're here.
Elizabeth?
I don't really have anything to add.
Okay. Let's see. What else do we have? I think I'm going to try to get to all of these. We've covered Nogales. I'll slightly restructure the question, but the essence of the question is there anything in the USMCA, in the Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, or in any other part of USMCA that could be used to address the problem of survival of monarch butterflies in Mexico, in the US, wherever? Who would like to talk about that?
I could a couple of comments. The CEC has worked in the past in a very sustained way on the cooperative agenda addressing the monarch butterfly. These programs have been there for very, very long time. I think this is, in being the emblem of the organization, it's natural for the CEC to address these migratory species. So it is something that the CEC has worked on. There is plenty of room under the new ECA. I just mentioned Article 10 of the new ECA has 27 different areas of cooperation, divided in 5 major areas of cooperation. So I think there is plenty of room to continue working in the protection and conservation of the monarch butterfly.
Thank you. Elizabeth, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that one of the issues was the illegal logging in the state of Michoacan needs to be addressed, and that's been a big issue that the Mexican government has tried to deal with. The other issue is herbicide use on freeways and highways in the United States that have the path of the monarchs that they use, because trying to get rid of the weeds that grow on the highways, that also has affected the monarch in a negative way. And also the planting, I can't remember if it's milkweed or milk thistle, but the food of the monarch. We're not planting the right species, and it's confusing them in terms of their migratory pattern. And so I think that was something that a lot of school children were doing. Were planting food for the monarchs, but it was the wrong type. So we need to do it in a better way. But I think the CEC has taken a lot of work on the monarch submissions and trying to work with communities in the state of Michoacan and in communities throughout North America, because the Canadians are also very concerned about that.
Thank you. I remember from my 9th grade science class that it was milkweed. But
Milkweed, thank you.
Elizabeth, do you want to add anything?
No, I would just say, I mean, obviously the CEC has done a lot more work on this but I would just say that in the Chapter 24 provisions that, you know, there is something about forest management, which might go to the logging issue. Obviously, these are sort of soft rules in some ways, you know, in terms of how do you enforce these things, but perhaps there could be more discussion about that. And then I just wanted to note that, you know, there is a footnote 5, both in the labor side as well as the environment side, which, you know, specifically links this sort of presumption that a failure, a failure to sort of comply with environmental provisions is also a failure to comply with trade and investment. And I think that's a big step, actually, for the trade environment linkage. I don't know how that would be operationalized, but, you know, to the extent that you could gather some fodder, you know, from any of the sort of forest management provisions, the Endangered Species Act, which has been specifically incorporated into the agreement, you know, I think some clever lawyering could definitely sort of create a sort of an environmental issue around the trade issue, right? So link them more closely. Now, is that a good thing for trade? I don't know, maybe not, but but it definitely would create some wonderful scholarship for sure. A discussion.
No, I agree, and I would suggest that the monarch issue does have a trade link in the sense that it's a huge tourist attraction for families like my daughter and her family and their mother, who visited that part of Mexico a year ago, specifically with the idea of monarchs. So we're talking about something that does have significance. Finally, I got a couple of minutes. Elizabeth, you can start and then the others can add. Do you think that the expanded environmental provisions in the USMCA are going to find their way into future trade agreements, particularly those the U.S. negotiates? I mean, the Trump administration has started negotiations with the United Kingdom. I think eventually probably a Biden administration will pursue those. Do you think we'll see these types of environmental provisions in that agreement?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Definitely the original NAFTA was a model for the United States for future free trade agreements. I'm not aware of there being a CEC type establishment in any of those others. So I'm really happy to see the CEC is still well and alive, you know, for North America. But it definitely was a model for future US agreements. And so I could see the USMCA serving somewhat as that model. I actually see two models moving forward when it comes to environment and trade. I think there's the CETA model, the Canadian-European trade agreement, which goes much further in terms of chapters on sustainable development. It does discuss climate change. You know, it does deal much more in detail with border issues and waste and other things. And then there is the USMCA model, which is a bit more modest, I would say, in comparison with respect to furthering environmental protection in the context of trade. So, and again, as I mentioned, the USMCA, many of the provisions were taken from the original TPP, and we do have the TPP out there in the form of the Comprehensive Progressive TPP that other nations have signed on to. It'd be interesting to see if a new US administration will decide to sign on to that, because if they do, then that again, we have to talk again with Mexico and Canada, because, you know, Mexico and Canada are members of that. So I'm not sure what that would look like. But, you know, these are really important questions. And yes, I do think that we have established some kind of a model for moving forward on these issues.
Pablo Urasaba, would you like to add anything?
Just want to say, remember, at the end of the day, there are real people that are affected by these policies. And so we need to make sure that communities are empowered to resist, to demand environmental justice for all of us.
Okay, Pablo?
Well, I would say that the same process has been replicated in other agreements. So We haven't seen enough time for the USMCA to how this agreement will influence other agreements, but we saw how NEAC influenced other regional agreements. We have a same process in the CAFTA-DR, where there are 7 parties, including the US, and these are all agreements entered by the US. So CAFTA-DR, the Peru-US FTA, the Colombia-US FTA, and the Panama US FTA, all of them include a submissions on enforcement process included and embedded into the trade agreement. What maybe we saw is that how this inclusion or embedding into the trade agreement influenced USMCA to now have and include the same process into the trade agreement. So they have different, I mean, the model is exactly the same, the process is exactly the same, the steps are the same. We have even seen that even these secretariats have in the past quoted our determinations in making their own conclusions. So I think it's very interesting. We have in the past conducted webinars with our counterparts during Irasama's tenure here at the CEC. We invited and we received a delegation from the CAFTA-DR. Where we had webinars and a week full of events with them. So it's something that we continue and strive to continue our discussions and discussions, cooperation with them.
Thank you. We are now out of time, so I will convey our thanks to the 3 of you who've made excellent presentations, to our sponsors, the Center for U.S. and Mexico, Baker Institute, Haynes and Boone. I hope that all of our listeners have enjoyed this program, and I wish you all, I guess it's a good afternoon for all of us. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.